So, my name is Janine. I'm Raw Talk Podcast graphic designer, and today I'm going to be giving you some insight into graphic design. Basically, this presentation is aimed for anyone who's starting off their podcast and is starting to think about how to make their logo and design their social media content, or truly for anyone who's not really sure what goes into making a design, what kind of things they should be thinking about. So this session is going to run about 45 minutes, and the last couple of minutes are going to be for questions. If there's any questions that I can't get to at the end, feel free to come pop by the promotions discussion session where I'll be at towards the end of the day at 4:10. And again, leave your questions in the chat box. All right. So just a bit about myself. I am, again, Raw Talk Podcast graphic designer. I'm new to Raw Talk. I've been with the team for less than a year now. I'm currently a master's student at the University of Toronto in the Department of Molecular Genetics. So I'm not a designer by trade. This is just something that I kind of do on the side. I do have a couple of years experience in design. I've used Quark Express, Adobe Illustrator, Adobe Photoshop, and I'm familiar with more traditional art forms such as sketching, painting, and etc. So the overview for today is I'm going to first talk about how to use design to build your brand, and then I'll jump into some design basics where I'll go over some really common mistakes that I see in design so you can be aware of them and try to avoid making those mistakes. So first off, how to build your brand. So this is something we talked a lot about in the promotion session earlier today and a bit about yesterday. So what do we mean by building a brand? So when I'm talking about building a brand, I'm talking about setting a consistent visual appearance for your content across all your platforms. And doing this makes your podcast appear professional, and it helps establish your podcast personality because the way you design your content is a reflection of your podcast. So this includes the way you make your logo look, your website, your social media posts, your email, and etc. So as an example, I'm showing you here content that I've made for one of Raw Talk podcast episodes. This is what our YouTube video for that episode looked like. This is what our email looked like. This is what our Instagram reel looked like. And as you can see, there's a consistency across all of these content. There's the same color scheme, the font's the same, the photos are arranged in the same way. And the reason why consistency is so important is because your media is one out of many, many, many out there. You know, when people are scrolling through their social media feeds, they see so much content every single day. And if your content looks different every single time they see it, like drastically different, your audience is going to have to spend a little bit of extra time trying to figure out who made this. And those extra few moments that you're losing your audience on that for them to work for the recognition is a little more time that you might lose engagement. So it's all about the quick recognition. Again, I want you to think about really big companies like McDonald's, like Coca-Cola. Those have really, really recognizable brands. You know the colors, you know the font when I say them. So those principles apply to your content just the same. So now I'm going to go into how to design your logo and your other content. So first off, the thing you want to be thinking about is how to design for your audience. So the way that you design your brand can either discourage or encourage people from engaging with your content. So you really want to think about who you're trying to reach and cater your content to them. So for example, on this side, I have a really colorful graphic that's got these fun gradients and fun waves, and I would use this if my audience skews on the younger side because it's fun, it's colorful, it's dynamic. But if your audience is perhaps older than the audience that would want to click on this, you're going to lose them because they might see something that looks like this and might think subconsciously, you know what, this content probably wasn't made for me. I'm not so inclined to check it out. And therefore, you've lost a potential audience member. Whereas, let's say your podcast is aimed for a more general age group, something a little more simple is more appropriate and is more likely to be checked out by any age group. So remember that just because something looks really fun and trendy doesn't mean it's the right style for you. Truly, I can't emphasize that enough. It's not about looking trendy. It's not about following the current styles. It's about deciding what works. So if you're not sure how to design for your target audience, try to get inspiration from where your target audience likes to go. Where do they shop? What do they read? Where do they like to go to eat? And compile those pictures together to start seeing patterns so you can draw inspiration from those. So as an example, I'm showing you here a collection of photos where the theme is extreme sports. So you can see there's some similarities in terms of the colors, the way the people are positioned. And when you put photos of this together, you can start to pick out trends. So here we have a color scheme that comes out of these photos. So if your podcast is all about extreme sports, maybe you want to make your logo using these exact colors because these colors are directly pulled from images that are related to extreme sports. So next I'm going to talk about how to use font and color to express your design and to reach your target audience. So one thing I want you to keep thinking about is how you can use design to reflect your podcast personality. So fonts are more than a way to express text. Choosing your font is just as much part of the design process as images. To highlight my point, I've got a couple of images at the bottom. So in general, a serif font, which is a font that has tails at the end of the letters, such as Times New Roman, tends to look very professional and classic. The one thing I would consider, though, is that it can appear dull, especially in a really, really large block of text, because it might make people think of homework. So it's not to say that you can never use serif fonts, but it's to say, just make sure your image doesn't start to look too official if that's not the vibe that you're going for. Whereas a sans serif font, so that's a font that doesn't have the tails at the end of the characters, looks clean, it looks modern, generally are more legible, but be careful because there are some sans serif fonts, or frankly many sans serif fonts, that kind of are too designy and too artsy to be actually read legibly. So to illustrate my point about how different fonts convey different feelings, I've got here these three images where the text is the same, but the font is different. So on this side, I've got a really bold, chunky text. And I look at it and it feels fun. It feels like it's yelling at me. It's saying a loud statement. So something like this is more appropriate for something that feels energetic, maybe a little youthful, something that really has a strong energy to it. Whereas in the middle, I have here a serif font that when I look at it, I think this looks really classy, this looks timeless, this looks elegant. So if that's the overall feel of your podcast, consider something that looks more like that. And on this side is an example of a sans serif font that is pretty difficult to read. The characters are designed to be very thin. I can't really read it, but that aside, I want to point out that the style of this font is very artsy. It feels vintage. So if your podcast maybe is about old-timey things, you might want to consider something that looks along the lines of this. But don't use this exactly because it is tough to read. So when choosing your fonts, it's okay to go with multiple. I actually love using multiple fonts in my content, but try to stick with only one or two. If you start adding too many, your image starts to look too busy and it doesn't look good together. So just one or two, maybe three, keep it simple. Again, when you're choosing your font, make sure your font is legible. Again, some sans serif fonts are really difficult to read. Oftentimes you'll see fonts where the characters themselves are created to be way too thin, or the letters will be too close together, or the letters of the alphabet actually are really difficult to distinguish from one another. So as an example, here's some text in a sans serif font that is evidently pretty difficult to read because they're also squished together. So again, font is all part of the design process, and different fonts convey different tones. And when you're creating a brand, you're trying to express who your podcast is without explicitly saying it in words. It's all about getting people to recognize your content and know who you are right off the bat. So next, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about colors, because colors are probably the most important decision you can make when establishing your brand. So again, think about big companies. When I say McDonald's, you think of yellow and red. When I say Coca-Cola, you know the exact bright red that I'm talking about. And when you see those colors in their advertisements, I know exactly what that company is. So the same principle applies again to your content. It's all about that fast recognition, and picking and sticking to a consistent color scheme helps you establish your content and lets your audience know exactly who you are and what your stuff looks like right away. So again, as an example, I'm showing you some content from Raw Talk Podcast, where we've got our signature Raw Talk Podcast colors. So if you were to scroll through your feed and you saw these come up, your mind would go, oh, it's the Raw Talk Podcast content because it's the Raw Talk Podcast blue. So now how do we pick our colors? So first off, again, same like fonts, don't pick too many colors. Pick 2 or 3 core colors, just like your school colors. Your school colors probably had 2 or 3 colors. Same thing for your podcast. Pick 2 or 3 main colors. It's not to say that you can never use more, but stick to 2 or 3 that you use predominantly. And kind of like fonts, colors can express your podcast's personality. So again, think about your content, think about what your podcast sound is like. Are you casual? Are you serious? Are you investigative? Because different colors can convey different moods and feelings. For example, cool colors, which include blue, green, and purple, are calm and they make people think of nature. Whereas warm colors, which include red, orange, and yellow, are bold and energetic. So to help me illustrate this example, I have here an advertisement from Casper. I'm not sponsored. Casper is a mattress company, and we've got here a predominantly blue colored image, and it makes you feel calm and restful, which makes sense for a mattress company. And this is Headspace, again, not sponsored, which is a meditation app. And when I look at the colors they have here, I feel warm, I feel light, I feel happy. So again, the colors that you choose convey different messages without you having to explicitly say them. On this side, I have an example of a very dark color scheme and a light color scheme. So if your podcast is very serious, maybe you're all about hard-hitting news, maybe you want to go with a more somber color scheme because something that looks like a party probably doesn't make a ton of sense. Whereas if your podcast has this conversational kind of tone, or is just very casual, maybe you want to choose a lighter color scheme because it more conveys the feeling of your podcast. So again, colors and fonts are all part of the decisions that show off your podcast tone and personality without actually saying it in words. So how to pick your color scheme. So for those who maybe aren't so art savvy, design savvy, picking colors can be an absolute nightmare. So to help me give you some suggestions on things you can think about when picking a color, I'm going to go into some basic color theory using a color wheel here on the side. So first, I'm going to talk about complementary colors. These are colors that are opposite to one another on the color wheel. So that's red and green, blue and orange, purple and yellow. These are the most furthest on the color wheel, and they're most distantly related. So that means they don't contain one another on the color wheel. They're literally directly across. And because they're so contrasting, they are great for making things stand out because they're opposites. So using complementary colors is a great way to make content really pop. This is especially true for your text, because you want your text to be legible. But when you're using complementary colors, try to avoid using red and green for those who are red and green colorblind. That's not to say you can never ever use red and green, but you shouldn't use them absolutely exclusively or in an abundance. So red and green, you can use them, but really be careful with your use of those together. So let's say you love the complementary color look. Well, what do I do to make it look good? So first off, I suggest you pick one of those colors as your base and the other one as your accent. So by that I mean pick one of them as the predominant color, and the other one can be little accents such as your text or other design elements. The reason is, even though complementary colors can look really striking because they're opposites, when you have them in more like a 50-50 ratio, because they're so opposites, they look very clashing, they look jarring, they can look upsetting, which is not exactly what you want to convey. So try to use one as the main one and one as just to sprinkle in a little bit. You also want to introduce a lot of contrast by making one of those colors really, really dark and the one really light. So in this example, where blue is the base color, I would make my background this dark blue, for example, and this light orange for the text, because then I have a lot of contrast and I can see the light orange against the back of the dark blue. So you always want to be thinking of contrast, and I really, really want to highlight this for your logo, especially because your logo is going to appear super, super small on a phone, especially as a profile picture on a phone. So think about how small your profile picture looks on Facebook and Instagram. It's literally a tiny, tiny circle that's maybe 1 centimeter squared. So whatever you're creating has to look good at a size like that. So let's say you're really, really still not sure what colors look good together. You can also try using analogous colors that are immediately beside each other on the color wheel. For example, red, orange, and yellow are beside each other on the color wheel. You can also put purple, and blue together, because those are on the color wheel beside each other, or blue, green, and yellow, green. And because they're closely related, they have a lot of harmony to them. So they look really, really good together by default. The issue is that because they're so closely related, they lack contrast. So if you're choosing to base your color scheme off of analogous colors, keep in mind you need to bring contrast to make things stand out, such as your text. So if you put red on top of red, you're not going to be able to read it. If you put blue on top of red, that contrast is there so you can actually read your text. So another thing you can try is adjusting the shade, darkness, or tint, lightness of the exact same color in your design. Doing this adds a lot of dynamic into your image without things looking too messy with too many different colors. So in this example, I've got here a design with a lined zigzag kind of pattern, and there's a whole bunch of colors. And it's colorful, it's fun, but when you look at it, your eye doesn't know where the focal point is because there's so much going on. It's so busy. On the other hand, if I stick to one main color scheme, which is purple in this case, my eye looks at it and immediately the first thing I see is the text, because the text stands out. Whereas the pattern, because it's kind of melts into the background, is no longer the focus and is now kind of a nice backdrop for the text. So I highly suggest you consider adjusting the shade and tint of a single color in your color scheme, because basically what it lets you do is make a really complex design and get away with it. It makes a complex design look cohesive. I highly, highly recommend you consider doing something like this for your design. So now I'm going to move into a little more technical stuff in regards to color. I'm going to talk about RGB and CMYK. So I don't want to bog you down with too many technical things, but really what I want you to know from this slide is that depending on what you're making content for, if you're making it for a website or if you're making it to be printed out physically, you have to change your color mode. By color mode, I'm talking about red, green, and blue, or cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So in a digital space, such as your computer, all the colors that you see are made up of a different combination of red, green, and blue. Whereas things that are printed, so things that are printed on paper, on a t-shirt, are printed using cyan, magenta, yellow, and black ink. So the reason why it's important to make sure you're using the right color mode is that when you switch between the two, what can happen is your colors will change in your final product. And when consistency is so important, you don't want your colors to change. You don't want to have something be printed out like a business card and notice everything is the wrong color. So in a design program, you can change your color mode when you're making a new document, or after you've made a new document, there will be options for setting your color mode. Just make sure you're in RGB or CMYK. Again, I don't want to bog you down with too many technical details. The main takeaway is if you're making something to be read on a phone or computer, RGB. If you're making something to be physically printed, use CMYK. So again, how do you stay consistent with your colors? Which is something I mentioned before, and I did kind of have to introduce a bit about RGB and CMYK before to get to this point. Take note of your color values. So in the digital space, when you're making a design, every single color that you use has a certain values associated with that color. And to be consistent, what I really want you to take away from the slide is that you just got to write these down somewhere. Take a screenshot or something. So that lets you use the exact same color consistently across different platforms. So these are the hex codes for Raw Talk podcast colors. Basically, it's a 6-letter code in the digital space that says this code is for this color. So these values are for every color. Every color has these fixed values. You can find them in the color selection tool of whatever you're using. This is Adobe Illustrator. The hex code is down here. The RGB color values are up here. To the side are the values for CMYK. Really, what I want you to take away from this, though, is write these down somewhere, and you can just plug them in later on so you're always using the exact same color. So where can you find the color values? So I just showed you where to find it in Adobe Illustrator, but basically it's in the color selection tool of whatever you're working in. On Canva, which is was brought up during the promotions session earlier on, it's basically a free online design tool. When you go into the color picker, there's the hex code can be found down here, and you can type in the hex code for your color, and Canva will automatically just go to that color for that given code. That's the same for really anything that you're using. And I wanted to point out here a Chrome plugin that's kind of cool called Colorzilla. Basically, when you use it, your cursor turns into the dropper tool. So you can hover over whatever color that is on your screen, and it'll provide you the values for that color that you're hovering over. So that brings me to the end of this section of the presentation. So to summarize, defining your brand makes your podcast look professional, and it helps you reach your target audience. So remember, think about who you're trying to reach, what they like, and how can you cater your content to them. Keep your fonts and colors consistent so people can easily recognize your stuff. There's so much content out there, so it's all about that quick recognition. It's not about trying to be unique every single time. And consider your podcast and podcast personality, and again, your audience, when you're trying to design your content, when you're trying to pick the font and color that you use, because the way you design your logo and whatnot is an opportunity to tell your audience who you are without actually having to say it. These things are subconscious. People see these things and they get who you are without you having to say anything. So moving on, now I'm going to go over design basics, where I'll talk about common mistakes I see in design and other elements of the design process. So the hardest part of starting any project is actually the act of just starting. So here are some suggestions I have for you if you end up in a creative rut and you're not sure how to get out of it, or just how to synthesize an idea. One thing I mentioned earlier is you can try making a mood board, which is just a collection of photos related to a topic. In this example, the theme is obviously school. And let's say your podcast is about school and you're trying to think about a logo and a color scheme. So when I look at this collection of photos, the colors that jump out to me that are common to these photos are red, blue, and yellow. So maybe my logo is going to be red, blue, and yellow. Maybe I want a logo, my logo to have a certain image associated. So I might say, you know what, I see sneakers. Maybe I'll put sneakers in my design. I see a backpack. That makes me think of school. So I'm just showing you here that synthesizing ideas together like this helps you pick out common elements to put in your design later on. You can also try making a mind map, which is something you've probably done in class. Basically, you just write down an idea and you write ideas that come off of that idea, and you write ideas that come off of those ideas. And the idea behind that is that it helps you draw connections between things that maybe you didn't notice before. So let's say you're making your logo and your theme is cars, and you're thinking, well, maybe I don't want a car to be on my logo, but what makes me think of cars? So you just write whatever stream of consciousness of things related to cars, and from that you can start to see like, oh, like this is related, and that helps you connect and organize your ideas for your design. Trial and error is frankly a huge part of the design process. That's just a fact. You're going to try things and sometimes they don't work. One thing I like to do is I'll make a version of a design where I completely change the color scheme that I'm working with, or just swap everything out just to mix it up a little bit. And sometimes that's the one that actually sticks. So, you know, it's a fun idea to just add something completely random because sometimes it's actually the one that works. Another tip I have for you is to actually physically write everything down on a sticky note and just move it around a desk or your wall, because that lets you flexibly see how different things can be put together without you having to actually put in the effort of drawing everything. And lastly, collaborate and ask for feedback. You know, you're making content that is going to be seen by other people, so you want to know what other people think. So now I'll talk a little bit about what you can use to make your design. So we talked a lot about using Canva. Again, we're not sponsored, but Canva really is great. It's free, it's online, there's a mobile app for it. Basically what it is, if you haven't used it before, is it's a kind of drag and drop style of design website where you have all these cool templates, or you can start from your own and you can drag in clip art and other design elements, or upload your own pictures to arrange things into a design. It's again free, lots of templates are available, it's user-friendly. I would suggest you use it for your social media content and other digital content that you're making. But the con is there is no drawing capability. So if you're making your logo and you want to draw something, you shouldn't use Canva because you can't draw anything in it. For drawing, you're going to have to turn to some kind of drawing software. I use Adobe Illustrator. It's a vector drawing program. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what vector drawing is, it's not like something like Photoshop or Microsoft Paint, where you're actually digitally painting. Vector drawing is essentially the manipulation of lines to create shapes. And by that, you make your design. Essentially, vector design drawing is easy to edit later on, easy to resize, easy to change. So for your logo especially, you probably want to create it in a vector drawing tool. Adobe Illustrator is powerful. Any kind of drawing software, you have full creative control. But the issue with Adobe Illustrator in specific is that it is super, super expensive. You have to pay a subscription to use it, and it takes a lot of time to learn. If you've never used a drawing vector program, you know, it's not necessarily an intuitive thing, so it's going to take some time. We talked a lot about teamwork, so if you're starting out, you might want to reach out to somebody who has more experience, but there's also a lot of online tutorials available as well. So I'm not encouraging anyone to go out and spend a ton of money on professional software. There are lots of alternatives out there. I haven't used these personally, but I just wanted to list them for you so you can write them down. Affinity Designer and Affinity Photo are $70 Canadian each, and unlike Adobe, it is a one-time payment, so you pay $70 once and you have access forever. These on this side are free. There's Inkscape, SVG Edit, Boxy, SVG. This isn't an exhaustive list. This is just some examples I found. Inkscape seems to be one that people recommend. And one that I came across that is kind of more of an alternative to Photoshop is called Photopea. That one has templates already preloaded. So it has the sizes available already for social media like Instagram and whatnot. So now I'll talk a little bit about photographs. If you're an interview style of podcast, you probably want to include guest photos. One thing that that Nathan, our photographer, and Jesse, our webmaster, mentioned is when you're taking a photo of your guests, please include a lot of background space around the person in your photo so that you can flexibly crop the photo later on. I've personally experienced struggle with placing a photo if there's very little background because you're very limited with what you can do with that picture. So try to leave a lot of space. It'll save you pain later on. When you're placing your photos, try to use something called the rule of thirds, which some of you might have learned in grade school. The rule of thirds basically says if you take an image and you divide it into a 3x3 grid, anything that falls on the lines of that grid are a focal point, so your eye goes to them. And anything that falls on the corners where these lines meet is especially a point of focus. So your eye is really drawn to them. And to illustrate my example of how the rule of thirds can help you place your photos in a way that looks good and draws your attention, here's a picture of myself cropped in such a way that my chin is actually the center of attention because it kind of falls on one of the focal point lines. And you're probably not trying to get your audience members to focus on the chin of your guests. If it is, maybe if you're a beard podcast, but otherwise that's probably not your goal. So here I've cropped my face in such a way that my face is framed right in the center grid. So attention is brought to my face directly. So you don't have to follow the rule of thirds when you're placing photos. There's lots of examples of photos that look great without using the rule of thirds, but it is a helpful guide for you to try to make your photos really work for you. So now finally, I'm going to discuss tips for making an effective design, and I'll go over some really, really common mistakes that I see in design. So first off, color and contrast. Number one, don't use too many colors. Less is more. Make sure you have strong contrast. Again, this is really important for your text to be legible. Again, your logo is going to be super, super tiny on a phone. Same with your Instagram posts. One thing that I like to do to make sure my stuff is legible is I will literally zoom out on whatever I'm making it in or send it to myself on my phone and see how it looks. I really want to highlight this point because right now the art trend is to do everything monochromatic. And that means one color, no contrast. So make sure you have contrast. Text, big mistake I see in text is that people put text way, way close together. Literally make your text feel like it has space to breathe. Don't crowd it together. Less text is better. You're making an announcement, not an essay. If you're having trouble with your text, edit your text, delete your text, reword it in less words. That's the number one thing I can suggest you try to do. Make sure your font is legible. Again, make sure you can read it on mobile. Again, think about your logo. And really thin fonts like this can be difficult to read. So again, make sure you're focusing on legibility, especially on your phone. Again, using multiple text fonts is really great for adding dynamic to an image. What I like to do is if I'm making a poster, one of the fonts is going to be the title, the other font is for everything else. And it's just a fun way to say, like, this is the title. and this is everything else. But again, stick to just one or two. Once you start getting into too many, you just lose harmony and your design doesn't make much sense anymore. One thing that you can try doing is adjusting the space between characters, or this is called kerning. I wouldn't do this for every single word because that'll be insane, but think about this for your logo. If your design, you want to have all the letters evenly spaced out. So just to highlight this, the W and A here are closer together than the other letters of the alphabet, so you can manually adjust it if that's something that you want. You don't have to, just consider it. This is the #1 mistake I see in design. I apologize that I am running a little bit out of time, but I'll try my best to leave room for questions. Using your space efficiently is probably the #1 mistake I see in design. I see so many PowerPoint presentations when I attend talks that honestly the slides actually look like this. I am not kidding you. I see this all the time, so consistently. If there's one thing you learn from this, it's this. So I want you to think about your space in your image. This is literally your physical space that you have to work with, that you are confined to. Think of it as a budget. The amount of space that you have is limited and you need to spend it wisely to get the most out of it. So when you're making a post, you are saying a message, but you only have this much space to actually work with. It's like a character limit, and you need to do the best job that you can to say what you need to say in as little space that you have. So some tips that I have for you to make sure you are using your space efficiently is #1, first thing you should do right off the bat, make your text as large as reasonably possible. Just go ahead and make your font bigger. #1 mistake I see is that people will use ridiculously small font sizes. Your text should look bold, not shy. There's no reason that your message should look like it's hidden. That's not the purpose of your post. Your post is to make an announcement. Next, minimize empty space when you can. So after you've increased your font size, the next thing I would suggest you should do is increase the size of your images, like your photographs. Other common mistake I see is that for whatever reason, the photos are just so tiny, and you want to highlight your guests. You want people to look at them, so make that picture bigger. And if you still feel like you want to fill up space, try adding things like a border or a pattern, stripes and whatnot. I mean, leaving empty space is okay. You'd rather have something look a little too simple than busy, but if you're stuck on space, consider adding little things like that. To use your space efficiently, plan it all out. Write down everything that has to go in before you start. And again, try writing things on sticky notes and move them around. That can help you figure a layout out before you actually start. And I suggest you look at templates for inspiration. There's so many great templates that are out there. And sometimes if you're kind of stuck, it's really nice to just see what other people have done to just get an idea of how to lay your stuff out. Graphic design is really more like putting a puzzle together. You basically have all these different things that you have to go in, and it's all about figuring out the way they can be put together that makes sense, that looks good together, and is cohesive. And then another tip is to make sure your image is the right size. Different platforms use different image sizes, and if it's the wrong size, you're gonna get your image cropped or pixelated. So Canva does have templates already made with the right dimensions. If you're using templates, you're good to go. But if you do need to know the size that you need to make something for, just look it up online. For example, here's just an image I found that shows the dimensions for Instagram's different posts. So this information is easily found. And some additional tips: make templates for everything that you are going to use. So I've made templates for our Instagram Reels. Templates are fantastic. Again, when consistency is so important, just having a template makes your life so much easier. Other tip, I mentioned this earlier, but a simple design is better than a really busy, complex design, especially for your logo. Again, always think about how your content is going to be viewed. And for a lot of your stuff, it's going to be on mobile. Mobile is so much smaller than a computer. So you really need to make sure everything that you're making is actually visible from a teeny tiny, tiny size. And you know what? Simple is better. It is much better to have a design that looks a little too empty than a design that looks way too convoluted. And save your important designs like your logo as an SVG file type. That's a vector editing file type, so that if you need to make changes later on, maybe you have to resize it, maybe you want to change the color, you can easily do that. And also save a transparent PNG file of your logo so that if you have to quickly whip up a design, you can just throw your logo on something really quick and you're good to go. So that just makes your life a little easier. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my presentation. So to summarize what I've talked about today, your visual brand, who you are, what your podcast is about, and helps draw in your target audience. Consistency is key. Make templates and try to use the same color scheme and font all across your platforms. Less is more, less font, less colors, just less, and be efficient with your use of space. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I'll take questions now, but again, you are more than welcome to come to the discussions later on if there's something else you want to talk about or that I can't get to today. So thank you. Okay, so let me go through the questions here. All right, Yagnesh is asking, what does the process look, oh goodness. What does the process look like when I get a request for a graphic? So, I mean, my process looks different from anyone else's. I'm a very visual person. So for me, my process is taking out a piece of paper and just drawing any idea that comes to mind. Something that Jeremy pointed out yesterday that I want to emphasize is inspiration in the chaos. Honestly, a stream of consciousness is a great way to get your ideas out. I literally just draw whatever I think about that is related to the topic that I'm trying to create. And from there, I start to pick out and refine and be like, okay, I like this, I like this, I like this. Also, the design process is collaborative. I always work with other people. I always ask for help. Because again, like when you're working on something so closely, you tend to get really lost in the details and you start to honestly hate what you're working on because you're just so tired of it. So it really helps to ask people. It helps to just do as much as you can, stop, send it to someone for feedback, and come back to it the next day. So that's usually what my process looks like. A lot of back and forth with other people. Kristen is asking, how do you go about choosing which graphic design tool to design for a different purpose? I want to reiterate that I'm not a professional. I'm a scientist first and foremost. So I'm not necessarily an expert when it comes to a lot of the different design tools. I started using Adobe because it is kind of the industry standard. I used to use Quark Express, but it's less powerful, and I started getting frustrated with that. I haven't used InDesign, but InDesign I know is really popular. That's more of a layout kind of thing. So that's something that's more for like web design. If I need to draw something, you're gonna have to use like Illustrator or Photoshop. Photoshop again is more of a painting, is more about photo editing and painting. So that's it's not necessarily for logos. Basically, if you want to make a logo, you should be making it in something that can do vector drawing. And really, like, there's you don't have to use any of the really expensive stuff. You know, the way I used to make my stuff was I used to draw it and scan it onto a printer and just edit the heck out of it on my computer with a default, whatever your computer comes with. So it's not about your tools. It's really about what you can learn to do with them. But right off the bat, I'll just say for your logo, use a vector editing tool. How do you maintain novelty in your designs while keeping them consistent? So that's from Atifa. So, you know, I'm not here to stifle anybody's creative mind. Consistency, I would say, is about making sure the majority of your design at least is connected to your core idea. Again, think of McDonald's. They have a ton of different ad campaigns and they look different, but there's always the classic McDonald's logo. You always see the classic McDonald's red. You always see the arches. So it's all about making sure at least you include some of your classic elements and having fun with it still. So when consistency, at least keep your colors somewhere and put your logo on everything. Slap your logo on absolutely everything. Thoughts on SVG and EPS. So again, I'm not an expert on this really. I'm still learning along the way. I do most of my stuff in Adobe Illustrator, so I save everything in AI. Yeah, I would use, I do save things as SVG, as I find that's the most flexible for me to work with later on as an artist personally. I apologize that I'm not necessarily the best person to ask with that question, but at least I can say that I can work with SVG file types. EPS I don't really work with. I apologize for that. Okay. So Connor's asking, I'm curious about the brainstorming process. Do you have the client in the room and iterate quickly, or do you have discussions back and forth? So obviously that first meeting, I try to get as much out there, but it is a back and forth conversation because, people's minds change. And the other thing too is that when you're working with someone who doesn't have an artistic mind necessarily, they don't think in visual ways. Oftentimes they're not seeing design the way you see it as an artist. So oftentimes I will bring to a person the idea they wanted plus one idea that they didn't think of, because they're not that's why they're asking for your help as a designer, because you're the one who thinks in a creative way. So, and I also don't ever want to offend my client either, right? So I do want to listen to what they say. It's all about working together. So when I go in, generally what I like to ask people first off is ask, what do you want? What is the goal? Who are you making this for? And going from there. So it really is a conversation. Nikita suggested Affinity Design Suite, so that's great. And Adobe Capture, nice. Thank you, Nathan, for clearing that up for me. Nathan's more techie than I am, so thank you so much, Nathan. All right, so we're reaching the end right now, but shoot me any other questions later in the design, promotions discussion later on. If there's one takeaway for yourself from this is that, it's don't stress out too much. Really for your podcast, what you really want to consider is just, pick your color scheme, pick your logo, and just keep that. And you don't have to be complex. It's not about trying to be the next Leonardo. I almost said DiCaprio, Da Vinci. You're not trying to be the world's greatest artist. You're just trying to show who you are. Most of the logos for the really famous companies that are out there are so simple. Again, McDonald's is literally a yellow M and it's so famous. Nike is just a swish. And same for your logo. I wouldn't stress, if you're not a design-minded person, I wouldn't stress too much about trying to make everything perfect. Most logos are really actually just the company name, and they look great. It's just the company name. There's no reason that you have to feel motivated to be the coolest logo out there. It's a lot of trial and error, and don't be scared to reach out. I always reach out. I reach out a lot to my non-design friends because not everyone is an artist, right? All the time, I bring stuff to my friends who aren't artists and ask them, what do you think? What do you like? Because those are the people you're making stuff for. So it's all about feedback. It's all about teamwork. And you don't have to be an artist. I have met many graphic designers, and actually many of them actually can't draw. Professional graphic designers, there's actually a lot that can't draw. So like I said, it's about solving a puzzle. It's not about being the best artist. Just letting you know, you don't have to be good at drawing. So if there's no more questions, I'll wrap that up. There's going to be about a 10-minute break, and we'll move on to our next session.